Hello there, my name's Annette with Sunbeam Fabric Art. Welcome to my channel. I shared some pictures of my teapots with some of my friends, and one of my friends wanted to buy the teapots as a quilt and a gift for her aunt. Here is the backing fabric she chose. It's a K fabric and it's beautiful. So let's get started finishing this quilt top. I previously cut down some backing fabric that was left over into 2.5 inch wide strips. I'm using that 2.5 inch width as sashing for this quilt. The quilt layout is 3 blocks across, 4 blocks down, a total of 12 of these teapots, and I'm sashing in between, and then I'm using that same fabric going around the outside as a border. I sewed a few of those 2.5 inch strips end to end to get enough to go around the outside of the quilt. I trimmed the 4 corners and pressed all the rows and sashing nice and flat. For teapot number 3, I put some black thread in my machine and I blanket stitched all around the outside of the teapot because the teapot and the background kind of blended in a little too much. Next, I pressed the backing fabric nice and flat, and then I needed to cut it in half and stitch the 2 halves together, which exactly fit the teapot quilt. I also used a zigzag stitch to join 2 pieces of batting that weren't big enough, so I could have enough for this quilt. With all the parts ready to go, I got my quilt sandwich together. The first thing I did was make my sandwich, smooth everything out, and then I decided to pin. So I'm using big quilt basting pins to pin this all together. To quilt this quilt, I decided to use a serpentine stitch, and I just went across the quilt horizontally, made lines about 2 inches apart. I did go back once I had it all done and I filled in some gaps that I thought were a little too large. But when I was done, I think most of the spaces between the stitching were about 1.5 to 2 inches. I took the pins out of those sashing rows and added a little bit more stitching. Somehow I snipped into the background of one of my teapots, so what you see me doing here is making a little tiny patch and stitching it down with a blanket stitch. With all the quilting finished, I trimmed all 4 sides of this quilt nice and straight. I salvaged any of that backing fabric that I could. Next, I stitched a few 2.5 inch by width of fabric black strips together, and this was going to be the binding for this quilt. I will leave a link in the description to my quilt finishing playlist. It has a couple of videos that I slow down this process a little bit, but I pretty much do my binding the same way every time. Although in my last batch of charity quilts, I did fold over binding, and boy, that was a time saver. I start my edge of my binding by folding it over at a 45-degree angle and then folding it in half again. This creates a little pocket, and when I'm all the way around the quilt, I can tuck the tail end right into that pocket. I'm going to start stitching this binding to the back of the quilt first. When I get to a corner, I sew off at a diagonal to the corner, then I flip my binding up at that 45-degree angle, then I fold it back down upon itself and start stitching down the new side. When I get around that last corner, I'm going to snip off my tail, matching the same angle as the pocket. And that way I'll have just a little extra to tuck into that pocket. And here is why you should probably put a clip in the beginning of your binding, because I stitched a little too far, had to rip out just a few stitches to have enough room for that beginning part of my binding to go under the new part. The next step will be to flip all this binding over to the front side of the quilt, and I will be stitching this down with my machine to the front. Now some people like to stitch the binding to the front of the quilt first, flip it around to the back and hand stitch that binding down. I like to do a machine stitch on the front of the quilt so I can see exactly where it's going to be, and sometimes I'll use a decorative stitch. For this quilt, I went all the way around the quilt, folding that binding over to the front and clipping it into place. I decided, after looking at my decorative stitches, to use a blanket stitch to tack down this binding to the front of the quilt. Here is a close-up of how those blanket stitches look on the front and the back. I did add a label and threw this quilt into the machine to wash it. and into the dryer to dry it, and it already has been given away to my friend who is going to gift it to her aunt very soon. All these patterns can be found on my Etsy shop. I'll leave links to those plus the Teapot videos in my description. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I hope to see you back again real soon.